Good afternoon, Eugenio. It's a real pleasure to have you here to chat for 40 minutes or so. Eugenio Yunis was head of sustainable tourism at UNWTO when I first became involved with tourism, and I thought that Eugenio was in some way typical of the resources of the UNWTO. And then as I got to get to know UNWTO better, I realized how extraordinary Eugenio's contribution has been to the development of sustainable tourism internationally. Eugenio, you more than anybody else, I think, put your mark on what sustainable tourism is, and you did that in the best possible way by engaging with lots of experts and building some real expertise. I'm not going to embarrass you further by going on about how wonderful your work was, but it was. Let's take that as read. Can I ask you a different kind of question? When you look back now, you were there, what, 97 to 2007 or thereabouts, was those 10 years. When you look back at it now and you look at all the work that was done, much of it, as I've said, is a very high standard, what's happened to it? How do you see it now, 30 years on?
Yeah. Well, thank you, first of all. Thank you, Harold, for this interview. And I think we are in a very good and bad moment in history, in the world, to make this kind of balance of what has happened. I think the best thing I did, to be perfectly clear and honest, was to collect, when I was there, from 97 to 2007, to collect all the expertise that had already been developed by several countries, by a number of experts in different countries, and collect all that and build a sort of worldwide knowledge and know-how on sustainable tourism. And we even changed the wording. Instead of calling Department of Sustainable Tourism within UNWTO, we called it Department of Sustainable Development of Tourism, to emphasize, to make it very clear that it wasn't a type of tourism, sustainable tourism, against all other forms of tourism. But all types of tourism had to develop and be managed in a sustainable way. And with the collecting, I remember we had once, and I think you were there, a team of 64 experts developing indicators for sustainable tourism, because many people said, yes, yeah, but how can we measure what is sustainable and what is not sustainable? So we convened this huge team of experts working. I think we met once only in Madrid, but the rest of the time was through media, like Zoom did not exist at that time, but there were electronic communication media which we could use. And we came up, the first output of that work was this huge manual with about 300 sustainable tourism indicators. And we made it clear that it wasn't necessary to use 300 indicators, but you could select at each destination, depending on the most vulnerable aspects of those destinations, you could select 25, 30, 40 indicators to monitor sustainability in tourism in those destinations.
But Eugenio, when you look back now on that incredible work, and I still use it, it's on my bookshelf here, but when you look back on that now, why didn't we have more influence with that?
Well, let's go to that. The work we did, I think, was technically very good, and it's still valid. If you look at this manual on the other one, sustainable tourism, for a manual or handbook for policymakers, this is still valid, and I use it today when I work in Chile with students or with government or with the local authority. Everything is still valid. But what happened? I think the main problem has been a political one. I think governments who are a key issue on this. I mean, the private sector develops and operates tourism and tourism companies, but they work under certain rules established by governments. And if governments do not fully commit themselves to sustainable approaches to tourism, then the private sector will operate in the best possible manner to maximize financial or economic returns, but not to maximize the benefit for the local community or for the environment. That's the nature of the private sector, and there is nothing to blame about it. The thing to blame is that governments have not, in general terms, there are exceptions of course, have not really committed to these sustainable tourism principles and objectives. And the main indicators they use for the success of tourism is number of tourist arrivals.
Yeah.
I think that is an issue, that is a key factor, because if your success or failure is just measured in numbers of tourists arriving in your country or in your particular destination, then the sustainable tourism principles are of no importance to them. And I think here I will make a criticism to my former employer, the World Tourism Organization. I think, and I strived while I was there to change in the Department of Statistics, to change the orientation to our statistics from just arrivals to other indicators, and there are many indicators available, but that was not possible because you had the Secretary General had to please governments and ministers of tourism, and ministers of tourism wanted to show that they had increased when from the moment they were appointed in the ministry, they had 100 visitors, and 2 years later they had 110, so they could show, we've grown 10%. And I think that's a major issue. It looks minor, but it's a key issue. The indicator you use for measuring the success of tourism is still international tourist arrivals. And we see it now in the pandemics that people, again, they are measuring, we had a fall of 75%. Yeah, it's a bad thing to have that fall, but it's not the only indicator.
No,
So,
Eugenio, I'm only smiling because I agree with you, and it frustrates me as much as it does you. It is extraordinary. And if you just go over the border into Peru, there in South America, I worked a lot in Peru, and it always struck me as really odd that every tour operator just wanted more and more hotels in Cusco and more rapid exit and entry. In reality, of course, the north of Peru is a lot more interesting and a lot more need for development, but the whole government focus was on more of the same in Cusco and enabling more people to send more people to Machu Picchu. I just think it's really sad that governments have got into that habit.
Exactly. So there are a few exceptions here and there. Even within countries, you have exceptions. But I would say that 90% or more of governments and different ministers, the only measure they have is numbers of tourist arrivals. And that's very sad, because you could have such a wide range of indicators to measure the success of tourism, but they are not. I think that's the main issue. And that's, I think, my balance of these 25 years since the sustainability issue has been dealt with in tourism policies. It's funny, because I was looking at a survey conducted by UNWTO, in which they asked governments whether their national tourism policy was linked to other policies within the country. And it's very revealing that in many cases, some 45, 48% of cases. I remember I have the results somewhere there that I used recently at a conference with the Inter-American Development Bank. About 40, I think it was 48% of tourism policies of the 120 countries that had replied to that survey were linked to the environmental policy. And some, a similar percentage, perhaps a few points less, 42, 44%, they responded that their tourism policy was linked to the sustainable tourism policy, and so on, or to the poverty reduction policy. Those results encourage me to think that, yes, they put it in their policy and they say tourism can contribute to the environmental policy, or tourism can contribute to the reduction of poverty. But then when you see the particular activities, the particular measures, or the particular funding resources that the government puts to tourism, it all goes to increasing the numbers of tourists. So I think if we can measure some progress, if we can identify a type of progress, is that there is clearly today more awareness than in 1995, say, or in 2000. There is more awareness of the potential of tourism to solving a number of problems linked to sustainability. But whether that reflects, that awareness reflects in the day-to-day business of tourism, I'm not sure. That's where the problem is.
I think we see in a few cities now, I think particularly of Lisbon and Barcelona, Amsterdam, as examples of cities which are refocusing on managing tourism and seeing marketing as part of the way you manage tourism, rather than seeing the main focus just being on promotion and just getting more people to come.
Right.
There has been a shift in a few places, but surprisingly few.
Very few, and places that had to wait to suffer from tourism to start taking reactive policies. So do we need to wait until the situation is critical to react? I don't think we do. Nowadays, we have the know-how how to make things better from the start, instead of having to rectify, which is surely more difficult and more expensive to rectify after you've done the damage to the environment or to the local communities. Mm-hmm.
The trouble is, Eugenio, both you and I are old enough to know that it does seem that the normal human process is to wait until the last minute and then decide to do something about it. And we see that with the climate change agenda as well, don't we?
Yeah. It's the same situation. We have to wait, then to go back on our steps and say, we've done it wrongly, let's correct. But the problem with tourism is that the correction or the reversal of negative impacts is very difficult, because in the meantime, there have been thousands of tourism companies created of all sizes. And many of them are really very, very small entrepreneurs that have devoted efforts and their little financial means to create a tourism company. And for them, it's extremely difficult to go back and start again. So if you establish a set of rules, a very clear rules from the beginning, then people who want to start a tourism business would know from the start, how do you have to do it? And that would be much more efficient in social terms and economic terms, and also in terms of the enthusiasm of these small and medium-sized companies that are generally family businesses. So
they're really, aren't they? I mean, those small businesses, Eugenio, are really what gives tourism its local flavour, isn't it? It's exactly that local connection.
Exactly, exactly.
But when I was going back and forth to Lima, I'd so often hear in the ministry that they were under pressure again to permit the building of another hotel at Cusco, because that was just seen as the easy way. So all of the marketing effort, everything piles into Cusco. You don't get that distribution of benefit. And if I remember rightly, I think the only country that ever had targets for distributing tourism around the country was New Zealand, and it didn't last very long there. They abandoned it quite quickly, but they did for a period have that.
Yes. Now that issue of distributing tourism or tourists throughout the country, in many cases it is possible, but in many other cases it isn't.
No, it isn't. That's right.
You take big cities like your own city, London or Paris or Rome. I mean, you can tell visitors, look, go and visit the outskirts of Rome. Go and visit the countryside close to London, which is wonderful. But everyone wants to see London Bridge and the Tate and Piccadilly, and the same in Rome. So what can you do with those masses of people wanting to go exactly to the same places?
So do you think it's unreasonable, Eugenio, to think of over-tourism as a consequence of the failure of sustainable tourism?
Oh, it is. It is in part. In part is part of the failure of not applying sustainable tourism principles in development. But it is also, over-tourism has another root, which is the fact that many more people have got access now to tourism. So, and that, as it was not managed, and on the contrary, they, as we said before, governments and local authorities wanted more and more tourists in their destinations. So that is another important element for over-tourism, that travel, both transport and accommodation, became much cheaper today, and you have more middle classes with possibility of spending money in tourism. So that's another issue that has not been duly addressed, but it's not a result, it's not strictly a result of not applying sustainability. It's another component which has not been tackled appropriately. And I think if I was again at UNWTO, what I would do is I would start collecting the very few good experiences on how to control the numbers of tourists in a destination, and try to draw lessons from there, and then develop a methodology or a know-how to control numbers of tourists. There are many ways of doing that. Some are more successful, some others are less successful, but I think it's something that has not been done so far, except in some a few destinations on their own initiative, or some academics that have done an intellectual work there, academic work, but I don't see the World Tourism Organization addressing that issue in a serious manner. It's very unfortunate.
But sadly, Eugenio, I think it's another one of those areas, and I've been guilty of it myself quite a lot, is the theory is the easy bit. It's applying it which is more difficult. And if you look at both Venice and Barcelona, which I've looked at closely on this over-tourism issue, one of their big challenges is they can't control the rate of traffic flow to the city. They don't control the airport arrivals. They don't control the port arrivals. They don't control when people get off the boats. There are very few levers that the local government structure has over tourism. So again, you're back with a governance problem, I think, of disconnected opportunity. And those governance issues are at the core of this.
Exactly. No, governance is another issue which has affected sustainability, because if you had real public-private governance in destinations. And if the public sector, which is the first one to take responsibility for sustainability at destinations, if they work together, truly together, and they took decisions together, then the private sector would know perfectly well what to do, and they would know the damages that tourism can make, and they would know when to stop attracting more tourists, and they would know many other aspects of sustainability, which today, in many cases, they are ignorant. They don't know those risks, and they just keep growing and growing and growing. More is beautiful, how to put it.
It's one of the things I always used to amuse my students with when I was teaching Eugenio, is that I've never been to Disneyland and probably will never go, but I'm very passionate about their success in managing tourism sustainably, precisely because they are managing all the elements of that experience. And they are able, I mean, they may sell a lot of beef burgers, but they clean up afterwards as well. I mean, it's an interesting model in that way, isn't it?
Yes, yes. Also, I think they develop good techniques for the so-called queuing techniques.
Yes, absolutely.
And probably today, I know there are several tourist attractions in various countries that apply those techniques. And now you cannot just arrive in Granada and go to the Alhambra as if you were the only tourist on earth.
Yeah.
The same for many other of these top attractions, but that refers to single attractions and not to the destination as a whole.
Yes.
So you may have that very well managed Alhambra or Schönbrunn in Vienna, but the rest of the city remains crowded.
That's the next challenge, isn't it, for city governments, is to move on into managing the destination.
Yeah. And there is another, let me do another link. And I think city governments and local authorities have been slow, and perhaps more than slow, I don't know how do you say it in English, to react in front of the so-called collaborative or sharing economy in accommodation.
Yeah.
The Airbnbs and similar platforms that have increased the problem of sustainability in cities. And local authorities, again, because with one eye they were saying, I'm getting more tourists in the city, that is good.
Yeah.
With the other, they were trying to respond to the established hotel and accommodation sector, but they haven't taken really, perhaps Amsterdam has, Paris in a little manner, and a few, but to stop or to regulate seriously that type of informal accommodation in order to avoid these problems.
Yeah, I think Barcelona has been particularly successful. But Lisbon, I saw the mayor there has decided to try and encourage the Airbnb owners to revert back to doing, he will guarantee the longer term lets, particularly for essential workers in the health services, so that they could repopulate Lisbon with people who need to live there because they work there. It's a really exciting new initiative. And in a way, it is the mayors who have that opportunity to take a whole of government approach, I think, rather than the tourism minister. A mayor at the local level can bring all the elements together.
Yeah, yeah. But I read a few, I think last week, that in Barcelona, really the Catalan government, not Barcelona city, draw legislation to regulate the short-term accommodation.
Yeah.
But they did it in such a way that Barcelona city reacted against it. Because what they say is, yes, you can let your house, but you have to stay within the house. You have to stay and co-share with your visitors. which is impossible to supervise and to I mean, you need an army of inspectors to check every day that the owner of the house is living there with the tourists. It's impossible. So Barcelona city reacted against the regulation set by the Catalan region government.
But at least, Eugenio, for all of that conflict, what it demonstrates is that governments are engaged with the issue.
Yes.
And we're not seeing that in a lot of other places.
Yeah, at least they are engaged, yes. In my own country, in Chile, unfortunately, we started putting pressure on government in 2015 to regulate short-term lets. We changed government from a center-left government to a center-right government, but none of them in these 5 years have done anything to regulate this business. Now the only regulator has been the pandemics.
Yes.
That has come as a regulator because I think the Airbnbs are not doing very well, and I would not think that in the future they would do better, because people, when they start to travel again, the consumer will go for, I suppose, they will go for regulated establishments where you know that some protocols, health and public health protocols are being established, applied, and fiscalized by government, while in a private accommodation, you don't know who was there before, what sort of blankets or what sort of towels you will get, and so on.
No, that's right. I think that post-COVID, trust is going to be one of the major currencies of tourism, and it will be those businesses and destinations which can assure people that they will be safe, who are going to benefit. And that, interestingly, I think shifts the balance a bit in terms of the popular destinations.
And in that respect, I think those establishments, either accommodation or gastronomic establishments that already have some kind of label, sustainability label, will be at an advantage, because sustainability includes a number of issues that are related to public health and so on. So I suppose there will be a need for perhaps a new seal or a new certificate to ensure that the establishment, accommodation or catering establishment has already established the protocols and they are really implemented on a day-to-day basis. And I would say more, in some cases, not day-to-day basis, but hour-to-hour basis.
Yes.
In a restaurant, you have to check that when you change from one customer to the following one. And that could be a matter of hours only.
Well, I was going to say, one of the things we're seeing with the opening up of the pubs and restaurants and cafes in the UK is that some people are going out and having a good, safe experience. But a fair number of people are going out not feeling safe. And those people, of course, are not going to come out again. So the more progressive places are very evidently cleaning the tables every time somebody gets up and leaves. They're on their feet straight away cleaning the tables. And that's how you build trust and confidence, isn't it?
Exactly.
You see it happening.
Yeah.
One of the problems I see with certification, though, Eugenio, and you'll know this, I've had problems with certification for a long time. And that is, so much of it is self-certification, and you can't see or know what it is about that particular hotel which makes it sustainable. And then you go into the room and the aircon is down at some ludicrously low point. There's a real problem about the credibility because of the poor behavior by some of the places that have been certified.
That is true, but I think it has a number of, if the certification system is well established and well supervised, which is a key issue,
It is the key question.
is the key question, like the supervision. And we, in Chile, we set up a system, a joint system, public-private, around 2013, it's 7 years old, and the duration of your label, is a green S label, is for 2 years. And after 2 years, to renew it, you have to show not the maintenance of the conditions which you obtained when you got certified, but you have to show an improvement on those conditions. So it is hard for the businesses, but those who take sustainability seriously, they are doing it. And we started with, of course, a handful of companies. Now we have about 150 companies, which is still a low number when you have over 10,000 companies. But those 150 are a kind of showcase.
Yeah.
And they are doing well. And I think it's a little step ahead in the sustainability road. And now the consumers are also aware, not all consumers, of course, but a bunch of consumers are aware that there are companies which has an S, and it has been during the last few months with pandemics, with COVID-19, it has been one of the factors that when you do consumer surveys, they would say, when I restart to travel, I will only go to hotels with an S because they will be safer. So again, I repeat, it's not a massive thing, it's not the entire consumers, but it's one sign of a little step ahead. And I know that in some other countries, we took as example, again, New Zealand and Australia, and I can't remember, there was one state in the US, only one state that had a similar system. We picked up the best ideas, and I think in those places things are doing well. Costa Rica has got a good sustainability certificate as well. But we are far from making the whole industry. Let me mention also, Harold, that surprisingly, there are some large hotel companies that have made progress as well, mainly on the environmental aspects of sustainability, much less on the social aspects of sustainability, and far less again on the over-tourism issue, because they don't mind.
No, it doesn't matter to them.
10 hotels in Paris, and they see that there is a market for another 2 or 3 hotels, they will build it anyway. But on the environmental aspects, many companies, large companies, hotel companies have made progress, and I think that has to be recognized as well. On energy issues, on water issues, on recycling issues. So those are progresses that have already been made.
Eugenio, you and I have never talked about the Sustainable Development Goals because they came in after you and I were in regular contact. But I mean, how do you see the SDGs now? Are they going to drive change in tourism? My sense of it is that there probably aren't, because there's so many of them. You know, it lacks focus. But do you see it differently from Chile and from your previous experience?
I mean, if you look at the 17 SDGs and you compare them with the 12 Sustainable Tourism Development Objectives that we defined with your assistance, again, in UNWTO by, I think the book was published in 2004, 2005.
Yeah. It was 2004.
You see that there is an overlap. So we were on the right track before the UN developed the 17 SDGs. And I think there is one of the SDGs, number 8, if I remember well, on sustainable consumption and production, which is key to tourism. And in that respect, I think the work of the international agencies, not only UNWTO, but several other agencies working at a global or at a regional level, should focus on sustainable production and consumption in tourism, because those are the two key elements. And I think the problem there, in what refers to consumption of tourism, is that there isn't sufficient tools, there aren't sufficient tools for acting upon the consumer. On the production side, you can make some progress because you're working with the producers of tourism. Take what we mentioned a moment ago, large hotel conglomerates, or big tour operators as TUI, which has made some progress as well, and in many fields has been a pioneer in promoting a better behavior at the destinations they go to, etc. But with the consumer, it's very difficult. So on the issue of sustainable consumption of tourism, for me, it's still a puzzle how to approach on a massive way consumers for improving their behavior and their responsibility towards the host destinations. I think that's a major issue still to be addressed, and I think that it needs a lot of intellectual work and to see good experiences here and there, and then to elaborate on them and so on. But I think ODS, SDG, Sustainable Development Goal number 8 is the crucial one for tourism.
It's unfortunate, I think, though, that it puts consumption before production, because in fact, it's much easier to change the product than it is to change the consumer behavior. And we know that from choice editing in supermarkets. You can easily change what the consumer does by what you offer. And I think that is, it's a real shame that it's that way around.
Yeah, I think that's, I'm glad you raised that, because the problem with, in some way, with tourism generally, and throughout not only the last 20, 30 years, but since the beginning of mass tourism after the Second World War, is that it has been, for the most part, demand-led development.
Yes.
Yeah. Instead of making it a supply-led development, what we can offer and what we want to offer to the tourists, rather than, the tourists want this, so let's provide it. And the tourists, it's much more difficult, as you rightly said, that consumers as a whole, they are not a body, they are a phenomenon, and much more difficult to control. So if you offer them sustainable products, they will go for them.
Absolutely. And Disney is another example of that in a way. I mean, there's a product which was designed to be, I mean, it doesn't attract me, but it attracts lots of people. Yeah, exactly. I'm a great believer in Disney. I think it's absolutely splendid for that reason. And there are other places which have sought to do that as well, I think. American national parks haven't done badly at that either. They've had to do it, and they've done it well. You can absorb a lot of people if you keep the people contained and don't let them just wander everywhere. That's part of the problem. Eugenio, I wanted to end, if I may, by asking you about COVID-19 and how you see that affecting the opportunities for sustainable tourism. I've just been writing a piece about what I think is happening, and there's been a lot of dismay in destinations in Britain, which I obviously know better, I'm closer to them, partly because people have realized they've had 20 weeks, 30 weeks of very low tourism. suddenly as the lockdown gets lifted, the tourists flood back. And it's a sudden change, whereas the tourists arrive slowly over many years. Now they flood back, and there seems to be more of a realization of the negatives of tourism because of the experience of not having them around for a bit. Do you think that's happening in Chile? Is it happening in other places?
I don't know that phenomenon. I don't know whether it's happening in Chile in particular. But what I see is that one, I see various points. One is that those particularly small destinations, and that doesn't mean to say that we are talking of a little Montserrat island in the Caribbean. No, but a small destination may be within the UK, a small town, or around a lake or whatever, or a small destination in the US or a small destination in Chile, which discovered tourism some 30, 40 years ago and left behind all the traditional activities. And they concentrated on tourism as their main economic sector. They are doing very badly today. And that's a good lesson. Sorry for the bad reasons, but it's a good lesson. You should not concentrate on tourism because it's a very vulnerable sector, and we are seeing it now.
Yeah.
First, the second concern I have about COVID-19 is that all those progresses we had made on advancing sustainability in tourism, which were very timid for the moment, very, very small progress, may be thrown away because now companies are trying to survive.
Yeah.
So that's. We also fear the same thing in 2008, 2009 with the financial crisis, that people would say, now our priority number one is to survive. So all those sustainability objectives, let's put them away. It's not the moment to deal with them. And now it is a risk that companies will say, look, you come and this has been my little experience with a few companies in Chile that I keep on talking about sustainability and they say, look, Mr. Yunis, stop. Now what we are trying to do is to survive. So that's another risk we have with COVID-19. But a third concern or a third aspect that we can is that it's a good opportunity also for governments, instead of putting all their effort in restarting tourism as if nothing had happened, and just putting money on promotion and promotion and promotion. They should use, that's my view, and I've put it very strongly here in Chile without much echo, I must say. Let's use this pause to improve tourism, and then in 2021 be able to offer a new industry, a more sustainable, a more responsible tourism industry to the consumer. And instead of wasting money, in my opinion, it's a waste of money to put money on promotion, because the consumers do not want to travel today. They don't feel safe. So let's use public monies, subsidies, low interest loans, whatever. Let's use that public effort, money and intellectual effort and administrative efforts in reconstructing the tourism industry in a more responsible way, in a more responsible and sustainable manner. And let's show next year, hopefully, if there is a vaccine or vaccination, I can't remember how to vaccine, and let's say, this is the new tourism industry, more sustainable, more responsible. I've written a paper on that in Spanish, and there is a very good book by a former colleague of UNWTO who is no longer there. It's in Spanish, Harold, but I don't know whether there is an automatic translation. He entitled his book, let me translate, Before Switching on the Restart Button. As we do it on computer, restart. The tourism industry and most governments are in a hurry to push the restart button. But his book is about what we need to do before restarting the restart button of tourism. And I think this is perhaps the best opportunity, because the hotels are empty, the workers are on furlough, you call it in English, and I can't remember.
Furlough, yeah.
Let's use this time to retrain them and to do the improvements we have to do in the hotels, and to do the improvement in transportation and in restaurants, etc. That would be the ideal thing to do, I think, and COVID gives that opportunity today. So those are my three concerns, two concerns and one opportunity that I see. And as I said some moments ago, I also think that companies that already had implemented sustainability measures, they will be in a better position to attract consumers when the time comes for practicing tourism again.
Yes, I think that's right, Eugenio. Can I thank you very much for this splendid interview? I'm glad we agreed about as much as we do, Eugenio. It's a long time since we actually worked together.
And that's my fear, that these talks, I mean, I thank you for the talk, and it's very encouraging to speak to you again, but my disappointment in a way, and I'm sorry to end with this note, is that in spite of all the people like you and myself, there are many of us, but I don't know whether we've succeeded in really passing these messages to the policymakers and to politicians. And I think there, and I repeat what I said at the very beginning, there is where the main problem is. If they don't change their view on what tourism can offer and how tourism should be developed, the private sector will not do it on their own. They won't. So I'm convinced of that. So governments have to react first. And one important organization that can act upon government is the World Tourism Organization. But I'm sorry, to be so frank, I don't think they are doing it right now in the middle of this crisis. I don't think they are doing it. On the contrary, what I see, they are encouraging tourism to restart without thinking it over, but just restart as if nothing had happened. And I think what has happened, and what is still happening with COVID, is very deep. It's not just a simple crisis of a couple of months, as we had financial and other crises in the last 20 years. It's not an earthquake as we had in Chile. It's not a financial crisis that had people fearing whether to travel or not, but then 2 months later they were traveling. It's a much deeper thing, which also has roots on environmental issues. The COVID is also originated in several environmental issues, and we can't ignore that.
I fear, Eugenio, that you are correct. I don't think we're going to live in some comfortable post-COVID world. We're going to live in a world where we are more aware of the risk of these kinds of viruses. And where those countries, the ones who experienced SARS and Ebola and the Zika outbreaks, those countries dealt with COVID a lot better than those countries which had not. And I think the question now is, if for societies, is which ones can cope with these kinds of crises best will be the ones which grow in the future. I think a lot of tourists are going to say to themselves, which countries dealt well with COVID? Which ones do I want to risk going to? There are some countries which clearly dealt with it very badly, including my own, which will be less attractive for tourists than those which dealt with it well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And another point which I forgot to mention is that we have also within, I've been in the tourism sector for several decades now, but we have to recognize as well that COVID or tourism has been an instrument for the propagation and the spread of this pandemic.
Absolutely.
And that we can't ignore.
No.
I haven't seen any single declaration of UNWTO recognizing this fact, that tourism is both a victim, but is also a vector of these pandemics. Both.
Eugenio, I wish you were still at UNWTO.
No, I'm quite happy back in Chile, but yes, I still feel it in a way my home, and I would love to be there to do some things, but I'm quite happy here, and the UNWTO time for me at least is over. So thank you again, Harold, and I'm sure we'll be able to meet hopefully in Chile or hopefully in London or somewhere in the next year or so, if COVID permits.
Eugenio, thank you very much. I really appreciate that, your time this afternoon to do the